Washington moved fast. Within hours of the border decision detonating politically, a police chief was gone, statements were polished, and the story was framed as order restored. Officially, this was about procedure, about maintaining calm, about doing the responsible thing. But the speed tells a different story. Systems do not move this quickly for reflection, they move this quickly for protection. This wasn't a single incident spiraling out of control. It was a moment that exposed fault lines Washington already knew were there. When pressure hits sensitive points, power doesn't wait for facts to settle. It acts to stabilize perception. The public is told events are isolated, unfortunate, under review. Inside the system, something else is happening. Roles are reassigned, narratives narrowed, and risk redistributed away from the center. This wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Outrage explains the noise, but it doesn't explain the coordination. Institutional survival does. When authority feels threatened, the priority is not truth or resolution, but containment. Who can be moved quickly? What signal reassures markets, allies, and voters that control still exists? The headline moment is only the surface. To understand why Washington reacted with such urgency, you have to zoom out, beyond the shooting, beyond Minneapolis, and look at what kind of shock this decision sent through the system. This decision was not a routine policy adjustment. It landed like a shock transmitted through a fragile system already running hot. In earlier cycles, border changes moved incrementally, slowed by court challenges, bureaucratic friction, and political bargaining. This time, enforcement surged ahead of consensus, ahead of capacity, and ahead of coordination. That difference matters. Border policy functions as a macroeconomic lever, shaping labor availability, wage pressure, and inflation expectations long before it reaches the fence line. When labor supply tightens suddenly, costs surface downstream. Cities scramble to fund services, states revise budgets, and employers quietly reprice risk. The timing amplified the impact. Markets were already jittery, municipal balance sheets stretched thin, and trust between federal and local authorities badly eroded. Instead of absorbing a gradual adjustment, institutions were forced to react in real time. Past border moves followed crises. This one arrived first, creating the conditions for crisis. That inversion explains the speed of Washington's response. Border policy doesn't start at the border. It ends in city budgets and political careers. The moment the decision landed, the real question shifted from legality to liability. Who absorbs the cost first? Federal agencies, state governments, or local leadership? History suggests the answer. The burden moves downward, the accountability becomes local, and the shock is contained by replacing people rather than rethinking policy. That is how systems protect themselves under pressure today. Minneapolis did not become the center of this story by accident. It sits at the intersection of symbolism and vulnerability, a city already etched into the national memory as a site of protest, federal scrutiny, and institutional fracture. Politically progressive, publicly skeptical of federal force, and structurally dependent on federal funding, Minneapolis offered something Washington understands well: a pressure point. In past enforcement cycles, power avoided places like this. This time, it moved straight toward them. Here, the contrast sharpens. Federal authority operates with speed, legal insulation, and narrative reach. Local governance operates with limited budgets, electoral exposure, and public trust as its primary currency. When enforcement surges into a city like Minneapolis, local leaders face a no-win equation: comply fully, and legitimacy erodes among constituents who already distrust centralized power. Resist openly, and leverage disappears as federal agencies tighten the screws. That is why the removal of the Minneapolis police chief matters. It was not punishment in the moral sense, it was containment. A visible change designed to signal control without altering the underlying posture. Systems under threat rarely pause to negotiate outcomes. They move to stabilize optics. When systems feel threatened, they don't negotiate, they replace. And once replacement occurs, attention shifts upward, away from structure and toward personnel. The deeper question now becomes unavoidable. If the city absorbed the shock first, who authorized the pressure in the first place? Washington's response unfolded with remarkable discipline. Statements were calibrated, timelines tightened, and the language carefully flattened. This was not the opening of a justice process. It was a damage control operation. Words like review, procedure, and safety dominated the messaging, not to clarify responsibility, but to slow momentum. In moments like this, speed matters less than containment. The personnel reshuffling followed a familiar pattern. Leadership changes create the appearance of accountability while insulating the system that produced the outcome. This is where power analysis becomes essential. In finance, when losses appear, firms write off assets to protect the core balance sheet. Politics behaves the same way. Individuals are written down so institutions remain solvent. Contrast this with how accountability is publicly imagined. The expectation is investigation first, reform second, consequences last. In reality, the sequence reverses. Consequences are assigned quickly, reforms are deferred indefinitely, and investigations become narrative tools rather than corrective mechanisms. Washington understands that public attention is finite. Narrow the story, reduce the variables, and time does the rest. In this case, the removal of local leadership served a strategic purpose. It redirected scrutiny downward while preserving federal authority upward. Responsibility rarely travels against gravity in political systems. In Washington, responsibility rarely travels upward. To understand what happened next, the event must be placed inside a longer historical cycle where crisis management repeats, outcomes stabilize, and structures quietly persist. History shows this moment is not exceptional. It is familiar. Financial crises, security failures, and federal-local confrontations all follow the same choreography. First comes the shock, sudden enough to overwhelm normal process. Then outrage, amplified by media and politics, demanding immediate response. Next comes the removal of a visible figure, a resignation or dismissal that signals action without touching structure. After that, stabilization arrives. Markets calm, headlines fade, and institutions regain balance. Structural change rarely follows. We have seen this after banking collapses, when executives resign while risk models remain intact. We saw it after intelligence failures, when agency heads change but doctrines persist. The logic is rational, not malicious. Systems prioritize survival. Removing a person is cheaper than rewriting incentives, laws, or power relationships. This script has been run before, just with different uniforms. The reason it persists is simple. Accountability concentrated at the top threatens continuity. Accountability pushed downward preserves it. By offering a scapegoat, institutions convert systemic failure into individual error, a narrative the public understands and eventually accepts. The Minneapolis response fits this historical pattern cleanly. A shock traveled upward. Outrage followed. A local figure was removed. The system stabilized. What did not change was the underlying posture that produced the crisis. History teaches that when stabilization arrives this fast, reform usually does not arrive at all. Speed is the tell, because rapid calm often signals power preserved rather than lessons learned. The macro layer is where this story widens. Border shocks introduce labor uncertainty into already tight markets, affecting wages, service availability, and inflation expectations. When labor supply becomes political, pricing becomes unstable. States feel it through budget stress, as housing, healthcare, and policing costs rise faster than revenue. Investors notice too. Governance volatility is not abstract, it is priced. Markets hate uncertainty, but power systems hate accountability even more. Short-term political wins reassure a base, but they quietly increase long-term risk premiums. Capital prefers predictability, and repeated federal-local clashes signal fragmentation rather than strength. That perception matters globally. Allies read coordination, competitors read distraction. Migration policy also intersects with demographics and growth. Sudden enforcement surges reduce workforce participation precisely when aging pressures demand expansion. The result is slower growth potential paired with higher social tension. These costs do not appear in press releases, but they surface in bond spreads, municipal credit ratings, and long-term investment decisions. What looks decisive in the moment often proves expensive over time. Institutions may stabilize headlines, but they accumulate hidden liabilities. Political systems can absorb shocks repeatedly, yet each absorption weakens trust slightly more. The macro risk is not collapse, it is erosion. And erosion, unlike crisis, compounds quietly until resilience disappears. This is how localized enforcement decisions scale into national economic signals that markets, voters, and institutions eventually cannot ignore. In the days after the removal, the machinery moved smoothly. Interim leadership was installed, internal reviews were announced, and federal messaging narrowed with precision. Officials emphasized cooperation, safety, and continuity, signaling that the situation was under control. The speed was striking. Decisions that usually take months unfolded in days, yet depth lagged behind velocity. Reviews were internal, timelines open-ended, and conclusions carefully deferred. What changed was presentation. What did not change was posture. Enforcement authority remained centralized, federal leverage over cities intact, and the underlying policy framework untouched. The language softened, but the mechanics stayed rigid. This is the contrast that matters. Fast action paired with slow answers. Systems excel at motion when stillness would invite scrutiny. The story also began to move on. Headlines shifted, attention fragmented, and new narratives crowded in. That, too, is part of the response. Political time moves faster than institutional time, and survival depends on riding that current. The story moved on. The structure didn't. What this moment signals is not resolution, but rehearsal. The system has shown how it responds under pressure, how quickly it can redirect focus, and how effectively it can absorb shock without altering its core. The open question now is whether this becomes an exception or a template applied again when the next stress point emerges. This story was never just about Minneapolis or a single border decision. It was about how power behaves when exposed. Modern systems are optimized for speed, optics, and continuity, not reflection. When stress arrives, authority centralizes, decisions compress, and accountability thins. That is not accidental. It is adaptive behavior in an era of constant pressure. The risk ahead is cumulative. Faster removals normalize substitution over reform. Centralized decisions widen the gap between federal authority and local legitimacy. Over time, trust becomes the scarce resource. Institutions may survive each shock, but resilience erodes quietly with every cycle. In 2026, power does not collapse dramatically. It recalibrates. It learns which moves calm markets, quiet headlines, and preserve control. What it does not do easily is explain itself. Explanation invites debate. Debate invites delay. Delay invites vulnerability. The unsettling reality is that systems under stress become more efficient, not more accountable. They replace people faster, communicate less, and harden structure. That is the lesson embedded in this moment. When power feels exposed, it doesn't explain itself. It reshuffles the board.